This is Anatomy and Physiology 1 by Jomari V. Agbayani, a future physical educator at Mariano Marquez State University College of Teacher Education. So the first thing that I will be going to discuss is the anatomical terms of movement. Afterwards, the concept of anatomical position, which both gives an additional background for us in order to understand each movement.
Anatomical terms of movement are used to describe the actions of muscles upon the skeleton. Muscles contract to produce movement at joints, and the subsequent movement can be precisely described using this terminology. The terms used assume that the body begins in the anatomical position. Most movements have an opposite movement, also known as an antagonistic movement. Anatomical position is described by these four criteria. Firstly, standing erect so they can be sitting down and must standing straight up with God posture, and face forward not looking to the right and left or up and down direction. It must focus only in facing forward. Arms at side with palms facing forward. If you reverse facing backward, it will be no longer an anatomical position, and the feet must slightly apart. Necessary to create a standardized method for all practitioners to describe the same body landmark. So this is the universal standard that always used no matter where you are. The anatomical planes are different lines used to divide the human body. You will commonly see them when looking at anatomical models and prosections. Using anatomical planes allows for accurate descriptions of a location and also allows the reader to understand what a diagram or picture is trying to show. There are three planes commonly used: sagittal, coronal, and transverse. A sagittal plane is a vertical line which divides the body into a left section and a right section, while coronal plane is a vertical line which divides the body into a front section and back section. And transverse plane is a horizontal line which divides the body into an upper section and lower section. These are the different anatomical terms of movement. First, flexion and extension. Flexion and extension are movements that takes place within the sagittal plane and involve anterior or posterior movements of the body or limbs. For the vertebral column, flexion is an anterior bending of the neck or body, while extension involves a posterior directed motion such as straightening from a flexed position or bending backward. Abduction and adduction. Abduction and adduction motions occur within the coronal plane and involve medial to lateral motions of the limbs, fingers, toes, or thumb. Abduction moves the limb laterally away from the midline of the body, while adduction is the opposite movement that brings the limb toward the body or across the midline. Depression and elevation. Depression and elevation are downward and upward movements of the scapula or mandible. The upward movement of the scapula and shoulder is elevation, while a downward movement is depression. Lateral and medial rotation can also occur at the ball and socket joints of the shoulder and hip. Movements that brings the anterior surface of the limb toward midline of the body is called medial or internal rotation. Conversely, rotation of the limb so that the anterior surface moves away from the midline is lateral or external rotation. Pronation and supination. Supination and pronation are movements of the forearm. In the anatomical position, the upper limb is held next to the body with the palm facing forward. This is the supinated position of the forearm. When the palm of the hand faces backward, the forearm is the pronated position. Opposition and reposition. These two movements are restricted to the digits of the hand. Essentially, they involve pinching, such as when sprinkling salt over food or snapping your fingers. Anatomically speaking, opposition involves touching the pod of any of your fingers with the thumb of the same hand. Preposition is the reverse, which consists of separating them. Inversion and eversion. Inversion and eversion are complex movements that involve the multiple plane joints among the tarsal bones of the posterior foot and thus are not motions that takes place at the ankle joints. Inversion is the turning of the foot to angle the bottom of the foot toward the midline, while eversion turns the bottom of the foot away from the midline. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion are movements at the ankle joint, which is a hinge joint. Lifting the front of the foot so that the top of the foot moves toward the anterior leg is dorsiflexion, while lifting the heel of the foot from the ground or pointing the toes downward is plantar flexion. Protraction and retraction. Protraction and retraction are anterior to posterior movements of the scapula or mandible. Protraction of the scapula occurs when the shoulder is moved forward, as when pushing against something or throwing a ball. Retraction is the opposite motion, with the scapula being pulled posteriorly and medially toward the vertebral column. Excursion. Excursion is the side-to-side movement of the mandible. Lateral excursion moves the mandible away from the midline toward either the right or left side. Medial excursion returns the mandible to its resting position at the midline. And this ends our discussion. Again, I am Jomari Viagbayani. Thank you and God bless.